Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to be here today with you. As always, we have a wonderful study prepared for this week, wonderful material for us to deepen our faith through Kirsama's guidance and messages, Masaksama's greetings, so that we can truly fulfill our purpose here in this world, be born anew as children of God, Messiahs. I'd like to remind everybody and thank all those who have already enrolled. The sponsorship program is coming along really well. We are having new people enrolling, well, not daily, but definitely weekly. We're having a good number of people starting to sign up. If you haven't been able to sign up yet, please take a look at our webpage, okay, worldchurchofmessiahusa.org. And over there, you'll see a tab at the top of the page with the sponsorship program, and you can sign up right from the page. So once again, thank you for all our subscribers who have already joined, and thank you for all those who are planning to join and will be joining soon. You guys really make it possible for us to be able to bring this message to as many people as possible. So we're really looking forward to this year for this program to take off. So without further ado, I'd like to start our weekly study. As always, everything that we experience, everything that we feel through this study, let us remember that God is alive and permitting us to feel these feelings and have these thoughts so that together with all humanity, we can return to God and be born anew as his children, messiahs. So, as always, let us begin our study with the sacred oath. Sacred oath. With great fear of God, we acknowledge that the Lord God is our true Father, the one and only God. We revere Meishu Sama as the model for all humanity and as our own example to follow. Meishu Sama, who was born anew as a true child of God, the Messiah, by receiving the divine will that God accomplished in heaven. We believe that Jesus Christ, who 2,000 years ago embodied the name of Messiah, the name most holy and high, is serving the Lord God in unity with Meishu Sama. And we regard the messages of Kyosho Sama, who reveals to us the will of Meishu Sama in this material world, as the sole, absolute, irreplaceable foundation in advancing our mission here on earth. Words of prayer. God, I acknowledge that you are alive. Within me, you are alive. I thank you for nurturing me to be newly born as your child. May this blessing be shared with all. In the name of Messiah, which is one with Meishu Sama, I surrender myself to you. Please use me as you wish. Okay, thank you very much. Today's hymn that I chose is actually a hymn that we've probably studied together already, but a very important hymn that brought much reflection to me lately. It's Kirsama's hymn from May 2021, and in it, Kirsama reads the following. I breathe in deeply, praying, may your power to revive everyone, to be your children, be with all. I breathe in deeply, praying, may your power to revive everyone, to be your children, be with all. When I read this hymn, it brought me to reflect that for a long time, and I believe I shared in a few studies ago, I took the breath, the very breath that we're breathing, as the physical breath, what we have, what sustains our life here on this earth. And that in itself, today I can see, is such a disregard and disrespect for the true breath, for God that sustains us through his very breath. If we stop to think and ponder on the fact that God is alive, right? And God is alive within every breath, right? There's the spiritual and physical, but at the center of that breath, God is alive. And it's God's very life and power that sustains us, right? And when we breathe, we're actually breathing because God is allowing us to breathe. He's breathing through us. That very power that revives everyone and everything exists at the center of that very breath. And when we start to see the world in that way, then we realize that everything, right? We, as Kirsam's been showing us, now it's much more clear, and only because we have these guidance from Kirsama. We took everything as ours. We took our very life, right? Our very existence, consciousness, breath, as something that belongs to us. And to recognize that before God, I believe is, as Kirsam's been teaching us, right? The most important thing, to truly repent for taking possession of that breath, God's very breath. And to recognize that our breath exists to serve God's purpose, right? We exist to serve God's purpose. And here in this hymn, Kirsama is showing that very clearly, right? I breathe in deeply, praying, may your power to revive everyone, to be your children, be with all. Right? This is recognizing God and glorifying God in God's very own breath. How many of us have taken courses on meditation, on breathing, or have heard lectures on breathing, right? And many a times we stop and we meditate and we breathe, and we do this to serve our purpose, right? To serve us, for us to calm our mind, right? To gather our thoughts, to be able to accomplish our goals. But at the core of that, we are not recognizing God alive at the center of that very breath, sustaining us, right? The power that flows through that very breath, the life that flows through that very breath. And indeed, through that, aren't we doing something not in accord with God's will then? By being in discord with God? In Meishu Sama in the Bible that was just translated most recently, we have this hymn from Meishu Sama that says, something that looks right and good to a mere mortal may look evil in the eyes of God. Hymn, May 21st, 1935. Something that looks right and good to a mere mortal may look evil in the eyes of God. Wouldn't the very fact that we've been living our life, taking possession of God's very breath, using it as our own, be that? To our eyes, it might look very nice, right? Very good. Here we are, we're focusing, we're meditating. But using that to fulfill our wants, our needs, our purposes, without recognizing God at the very core of that. How will God feel? Right? I believe that we're being nurtured to, as Kirsam says, right, to become children of God, messiahs, but to live a life that's recognizing God alive and within everything. And I think that this applies to everything that we've done, right? At least I can say that for myself. So this very fact that maybe someone says, right, something looks right and good to a mere mortal may look evil in the eyes of God. And let's take into consideration, for example, our very movement, right? The very practice of our faith. In God's eyes, could it be that it was completely the opposite up until now? Now that we're awakened to see from that point of view, as Kyosama is permitting us to see from God's point of view, I believe that it was completely opposite. And with that, I like to share with you why. With Kyosama and Masaki-sama receiving Meishu-sama's will, receiving the will of Meishu-sama, number 13. We do not hide God in religion. Okay? And I'll explain what I mean by what I just said now after we read a little bit into this, okay? So Kyosama and Masaki-sama receiving the will of Meishu-sama, number 13. We do not hide God in religion. This was just translated and made available to us maybe 3 days ago. And I'd like to read with you. Meishu-sama shares the following in his sacred word. You may find it strange to hear this from me, but before the end of the Second World War, I was not able to do anything related to religion. I was doing something called Japan Purifying Therapy, which is a form of folk therapy. But I would hardly call this proper work. This is coming right from Meishu-sama, right? I was doing something called Japan Purifying Therapy, which is a form of folk therapy, like a traditional, right? Japanese therapy. But I would hardly call this proper work. Some are saying this is not really what I was aiming to do, right? It's not proper. And he continues. After the war came the freedom of religion. And finally, I was able to do something religious. That is why my church grew into what it is today, and why I am able to publish books like Save America. Sermon, October 20th, 1952. So this is 2 years right after Meishu-sama opened World Church of Messiah. And he's saying up to that point, up to the end of the war, I couldn't talk about religion. So I was doing something that was not proper, what I really wanted to do. And then he continues. From before, I wanted to do religion, but that was simply impossible before the end of the Second World War. So I reluctantly did something called purifying therapy, a form of folk therapy. I had no other choice, as things related to religion were simply out of the question. But the end of the war brought the freedom of religion, and finally I was able to establish a religious organization. Sermon, December 17, 1952. Again, that same year, Meishu-sama shares with us, right? I wanted to do religion, but that was simply impossible because the war was going on, right? And it was prohibited in Japan. So I reluctantly did something called purifying therapy. As we all know, Jo-rei, right? The word meaning Jo, to purify in spirit, as we used to explain what Jo-rei was, right? Was this purifying therapy that Meishu-sama reluctantly, he hesitated to do, but there was no other way for him to talk about God. But the end of the war brought the freedom of religion, and finally I was able to establish a religious organization. During that time, society was quite critical of new religions, so I had no chance. I couldn't say that religion was what I wanted to do. Even with regard to healing, I had to hide our true identity and do it as folk therapy under the name of Japan Purifying Therapy. In those days, the authorities were on high alert against religion, so I was not able to do anything. But the war ended, and freedom of religion came into existence, which was a huge blessing for me. I was able, at long last, to officially register my religious organization in August of 1947 and start my religious work. From then on, I was able to do what I had really wanted to do. So it was not until 1947 that Meishu Sama really starts to do what he wanted to do, which was religion, not therapy. Originally, my World Church of Messiah officially started its activities as a religious organization in August of 1947. Until then, oppressions from the officials was so severe that I was forced to do my work in the form of folk therapy under the name of Japan Purifying Therapy. Having said that, healing power was weak without faith, so I had some people bow to the image of Kanon. Kanon faith was something traditional and acceptable to the authorities. I guess you can see how much they hated new religions. But how lucky I was. After the war came democracy and freedom of religion. And now I can advance my work through a religious organization openly and publicly. From these sacred words, right? And over a span of 2 years, Meishu Sama shared so many times. His ultimate goal was religion and to talk about God, right? To openly talk about God. And originally, he couldn't still because people were reluctant to. So he had people bow to Kanon, right? Because it was something common, culturally accepted in Japan. As many who have traveled to Japan know, right? Buddhism was so well rooted, Buddhism and Shinto, that you have temples all over Japan, and it's normal and okay for you to bow to Kanon. But outside of that circle of understanding, people were very reluctant to. But with the freedom of religion, Meishu Sama was able to do that. And upon reading this, one thing that brought me to reflect, before I keep going into Kyo-sama's guidance and Masaki-sama's greeting, is that for a long time, at least here in the United States, and a long time for myself, I was very reluctant to talk about God. Right? Even though I was in this faith, I was reluctant to share what we were really here for. And for a long time, I thought that the best way to do that was just to use Jorei, right? To show through Jorei. And then eventually we could talk about God. Or show through some other activity and eventually talk about God. But in reality, deep, deep down inside, I was hiding God. I was embarrassed to share or reluctant to share. People might not accept. People might not understand. So how can I bring this forth? So let's stick to something that people know, right? Nowadays we have all this New Age healing and other types of activities, these community activities, so people will understand. Let's try to do it that way. But it was in deep part going against the very wish and will of Meishu Sama, was it not? Because Meishu Sama himself, he was reluctant to do that for so many years. Finally, freedom of religion came about, and he was able to bring the church's true identity, World Church of Messiah, and put Messiah in the name. But for years, how long I've been doing the opposite, or I did the opposite. And how blessed we are today to be able to see that. It's a huge blessing. At the same time, a point of much reflection, I believe that each one of us needs to reflect upon. But a huge blessing to be allowed to see that. And these guidances of Kyo-sama are showing us that, right? We need to understand our true identity, why we're really here, and what we did up to now, right? If we don't recognize that, how can we go forward and really receive and follow Meisho-sama's will? And Kyo-sama shares the following here in this compilation. In society, we often hear something like flowers for a better world, where we plant flowers with an aim to create a more beautiful environment around us, which in turn serves for the betterment of the human mind, thus preventing, for example, youths from getting involved in crimes. Well, you get the idea, right? And we see these kind of projects everywhere, right? Nowadays, it's very common. You see community activities where, there are community gardens and community crop gardens, right? Home gardens and flower gardens, and beautifying the community to reduce crime and to betterment the human mind, right? That's very common nowadays. Many startups, many projects doing that. Through flowers, people are trying to comfort and soothe the human mind. Yes, sure, it is not a bad idea. But are these activities in society the same as creating heaven through flowers that Meisho-sama talked about? No, they are not. There is a mile of difference between what people do in society and what Meisho-sama taught us. And here we go again, looking at that very first comment from Meisho-sama, right? That in the eyes of humans, what appears to be good, in the eyes of God, is the complete opposite, right? And here, Kyo-sama shares with us, right? And for a long time, and don't get me wrong, I myself thought that to create heaven through flowers was this kind of idea. Now, for many years, I tried to develop many projects of the same, participated in similar projects, right? Where through that activity, through that flower, we create a better environment, right? We create a better world through that. But here we are seeing that this is totally different from what Meisho-sama was talking about as creating heaven through flowers. And what does Kyo-sama mean by that? He says, in the uniqueness of the salvation of our church, Meisho-sama said that what he does is different from all other religions. Didn't he? So there's a difference. And actually, there should be a difference between creating a better world that people in society usually talk about and creating heaven that Meisho-sama talked about. Make no mistake, our aim is, of course, to make this world a better place. But what did Meisho-sama mean when he said creating heaven? This is very important, right? Because when we read this, I believe some of us have that immediate reaction. Wait a minute. Isn't that what we're doing? Right? But, and what I mean by that, those activities, right? Those social activities. But, there's a whole different concept of what Meisho-sama was trying to show us. Right? Completely revolutionary when we look at it. And here Kyo-sama clarifies. Now, we can replace the word heaven with the world of God, right? Because heaven is the world of God. So we can replace the word heaven with the world of God. The world of God is heaven, isn't it? If so, is there any world, be it spiritual or material, that is not governed by God? No, right? In fact, does not God live even in a garbage dump? Does not God live in all our feelings that are both good and bad? Yes, he does. He made those feelings since he is the creator of everything. This is really, really interesting, right? For us to grasp, because we talk about God being omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, right? If God is present and alive everywhere, that means that in every situation, in every place, God is alive in everything. Right? So even some says here, right? Even in a place like a garbage dump, or you could say the most wretched place you can think of, God is alive. Commonly, we tend to separate, right? And we say that's not from God, that's not of God, right? This is evil, right? But God created everything, and God is present and alive in everything, right? God lives in everything. God is the one who created all that exists, and at the same time, he governs all that he created. The invisible world and the visible world, all the dimensions in the universe, and even the past, present, and future, they are all governed by God. It is this God who advances his work of salvation within each one of us, even now. I think this is a lot for us to grasp, right? With our limited human consciousness, to be able to see that God is alive and present in everything, that God is governing everything. Right? Today, as when we started talking about the breath, right, it brought me much reflection, because within the breath, we're not just breathing God's breath, within the very breath that we are breathing, as we breathe out, God breathes in, and as God breathes out, we breathe in. Within that very breath, God is alive. At the center of every thought, the center of every feeling, in every situation, God is alive and governing everything. With regard to flower activities, the difference between us and those who do similar things in society is that when we, followers of Mishusama, prepare flower arrangement somewhere, we acknowledge that there is no place that is not the world of God, including the place we will arrange flowers. We acknowledge that God's heaven already exists in the place where we will prepare flowers. This is very different from the way I used to see flower and the purpose of the flower activities. I used to see that we prepare flowers to make it a better place, right? To change that environment, so that environment can become heavenly. That's how I used to see. But how different it is from what Mishusama was truly showing us, as we can see now through Kirosama's guidance. We are acknowledging that in that very place, heaven already exists. That is part of God's heaven. That God is very alive in that location, in that place, in those people, in that situation. I used to do flower arrangements thinking, look, if I can't talk about God, at least I can bring a flower, right? And if the person doesn't want to follow or understand or listen about God, at least they can have that connection through the flower. And I used to use it as a shield to hide God at the same time. How mistaken I was. Today, I can see with a completely new light. if I ever do an arrangement or some activity, is to there acknowledge that in that location is God's heaven. In that place with those people, God is alive within them. And my purpose is to share with them that we are here to return to God, to be born anew as God's children, as Messiahs. This is a gospel for the whole world. This is not something that we are here to hold just for our church. This is salvation for all humanity. And we are so blessed to be able to serve, to be that bridge, to share that. But we must first need to acknowledge that that very location, that very place, God is alive in everything, through everything, because it all exists to return to God, to glorify God, and to serve God. Truly, as Kiyoshisama says, there's a mild difference. It's not that what's being done is bad, but there's so much more to it. It's not with our strength and our will and our hard work. It's by God's glory, by God's blessing, by God's will, that heaven is projected through this God-centered consciousness. And we return that all back to God through the name of Messiah. Masaksama, on top of this, he adds, even though the non-religious Japanese Purifying Promotion Association was growing and attracting many members, Meishu-sama decided to close it and instead established Japan Kannon Church, a religious organization, in 1948. For those of you who are familiar with the history of the church at the time, it was booming. People were seeking this therapy, and it was growing very rapidly. And I believe at that time, many people must have felt that shock, right? When Meishu-sama closed it down and said, no, we are now Japan Kannon Church. And then 2 years later, we're now World Church of Messiah. And he brought forth the true identity of our church. Even though this non-religious Japanese Purifying Therapy Promotion Association was growing, Meishu-sama stopped that. And he opened Japan Kannon Church. Meishu-sama did this while there were many who opposed this move. And as a result, they left him. In short, Meishu-sama's main concern was not whether his activities would be accepted by society or not. Our attitude should be the same. How many times have we been in those situations where we know that the true essence and identity of our church, the true purpose why we are here, is to share this gospel of salvation, but we second guess ourselves. We say, oh, I better not. Oh, that person might not understand. Maybe we shouldn't be so blunt, so open about it. I know that for years I made that mistake. For years I put human interest and my own human interest before God's and above God's. And how mistaken I was. And I'm sorry to all those who know me, and for years I shared that attitude with you. Meishu-sama didn't do that. Meishu-sama very courageously put God's interest first. Nowadays, people talk about organic food or natural food or this and that, right? In my opinion, I think we are deluding ourselves with these things, thinking that human civilization has somehow advanced. When we talk about organic food, we usually say that science has proved something, or the power of nature is great, or something like that. But why doesn't anyone admit the power of God? When are we ever going to do that? Right? So many times we see that not only in organic food, in the power of nature. We talk about, the power X, or this supernatural power, this extra something that exists. But we are so reluctant to say God. I was just talking to somebody a few weeks ago, and as we were talking about God and the existence of God, this person was sharing, well, when I talk to people, I don't use the word God. I use this, whatever they see as that power, right? This universal power. And I realized at that moment that that's how I did for many years, right? I turned what was truly the essence, the most important, I hid it away. Instead of sharing, I put it away. I said, well, if this is how you want to understand it, wonderful. Right? If this is how the person's going to understand it, great. But Meisha Sama very courageously, in 1950, stopped this therapy in this way, in this evasive way of addressing the situation, addressing God, and started clearly talking about God's true, holy, and sacred name, Messiah, and what that means, and our true purpose, and why we are here. And contrary to everyone's hope and expectation, announced that he was born anew as a Messiah. Over 60 years passed. And Meisha Sama very courageously did the same, brought forth the true identity of our church, the true purpose why we were here, and started to show us. And through that, today we can see how far, how distant we were from Meisha Sama's true will. How blessed are we to be able to do that? I believe we need to ask God to allow us to be able to talk with the same courage. We need to recognize God first and foremost. Recognize that we're here to serve God, to do that. Masaki Sama continues. I'd say we are really good at hiding God. Wouldn't you say? I think we became experts, didn't we, at doing that, unfortunately. When we try to spread nature farming, we say, since the natural world is God's creation, it is okay to say, society, let's appreciate the power of nature and eat healthy food. We're very good at hiding. What we must say to the whole world when spreading nature farming is this: since God prepared the natural world, let us give thanks to the one and only God when eating food. Isn't this the correct attitude if we want to spread Meisha Sama's nature farming? Right? Meisha Sama created nature farming, brought us the attention of nature farming for us to recognize God, not for us to make better crops. But we've been hiding. We say we need to remove religious elements in spreading nature farming, or we need as many people as possible to join the movement. All those things are fine. But what's the point of doing Meisha Sama's nature farming if we hide God? Wow, I now know that God grows and prepares all crops and food. This is right. We just want as many people as possible to think like this, right? Or are we ashamed of putting God out to the world when spreading nature farming? No, right? Actually, we should not be ashamed of putting God out in whatever we do. Otherwise, maybe someone might say to us, I see that you're hiding the word God. What's the reason for doing that? Is God something to be ashamed of? We really need to start changing the way we do things one by one. Meeting with staff ministers, October 31st, 2016. Published in the Glory number 16, May 1st, 2021. This was back in 2016. But imagine Meishu Sama's point of view, right? Meishu Sama's feelings and reactions. Meishu Sama worked so hard to bring forth God, right? Finally, the law in Japan changed after the war. He had freedom of religion. He was able to talk about God. He brought forth the concept, a word that really doesn't exist in the Japanese culture, which was Messiah, removing the word kanon so it could become global and bring the true identity of our church. And we did the opposite. We started hiding God, right? Changed back the name of the church. Stopped talking about God, started focusing on the activities, and actually started living those activities like every other activity in society, not recognizing what they were really for, which was to show God, to glorify God, and return everything to God. But now that we know, we can say, well, I didn't know. Now that we know, more than ever, right? This message rings true. In whatever we do, wherever we speak to, we need to share this gospel. We need to make a firm decision. This is about God's glory, not our glory. Not people liking, not people following because they agree or disagree, but about us doing our duty. Bringing forth this gospel of salvation to as many people as possible. Recognizing that in each and every location, within each and every person, this one and only God is alive and existing and just waiting to see if we're going to take that step of faith. If we're going to really share that. If we're really going to live that. Like I said, in everything that we are practicing, as Masaksama said here, right? In everything we do, like I said in the beginning of the study, for example, in our breath, let's recognize that God is alive in the center of that breath. It's God's power nurturing us. God alive, nurturing and guiding us through that very breath, through every object, through every thought, every situation. That one and only God is alive and governing. And let us glorify God. Return everything to God. Express our gratitude to God when we are allowed to perceive that. Because living life without hiding God is so wonderful. It's so different. It's so liberating. And it's such a blessing for us to be able to do so with that consciousness. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. And may all glory, may all honor be returned to God always.